Welcome to Transformations, interviewing people changing our world. I'm your host, Diane J. Shaver, and as you've seen by now, everybody that I interview is someone who had something touch them deeply, and instead of just sitting there, they stepped up and they did something about it. And we all have that power. So today I have the great privilege of interviewing a young woman who is stepping up in a way that's so important. And we're recording this the day before the election, so you'll probably see it a little bit later, but it kind of emphasizes what's going on. And this young lady's name is Brianna Sia, and she is co-founder of Generation Vote, one of the things that we really need right now. So please help me welcome Brianna Sia. Welcome, Brianna.
Hi, Diane. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
And especially the day before the election, so it's really good to have you. So I read that you have a three-pronged platform for Generation Vote, and it is educate, mobilize, and connect. So can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so at Generation Vote, we firmly believe that in order to turn out young people, especially our generation, we need to have a multifaceted approach to organizing. That includes educating our peers about the importance of our vote and the importance of voting for every single election that is on the ballot. That includes connecting young people with other organizers who are doing this work so we can make sure that we are amplifying our messages across the country and getting our peers out to vote and mobilizing each other, right? And I think there is a lot of anxiousness right now, especially the day before the election. And I think the hype around the youth vote is real. And so at Generation Vote, we equip our organizers with the tools and the messages and the language to mobilize our peers to not only vote, but to also take actions to protect our elections, whether it be through things like election protection or stepping up in a national pandemic to be a poll worker. So super excited to be here and to talk a little bit about how Generation Vote is educating, mobilizing, and connecting young people, both in New York, Florida, and beyond, before tomorrow's really big day.
It is a big day. I mean, everybody's feeling it. Doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on, everyone is feeling it. So do you think that your work and the work that's been going on with young voters and millennials and the Gen Zs who are able to vote, do you feel that it's made an impression on them so that they will go out and vote this election?
For sure. I think there is a lot of reasons for us to be excited about the potential record-breaking turnout that we can see amongst young people tomorrow on election day, and as ballots are counted from early voting and absentee voting. I mean, the numbers show that of the 50 million votes cast by just October 25th, which was last week, nearly 5 million voters were between the ages of 18 and 29. And so I think that organizations like Generation Vote and our allies who are out on the field, knocking on doors, texting our friends, and making sure that people have a plan to vote are working. And I'm really impressed by what we've seen in terms of young people stepping up to vote early for the first time in this election cycle. And I think the numbers show that it's working. And I'm hoping that tomorrow we can actually come out of election night and say that we had record-breaking youth turnout in both red and blue states, not just the typical swing states that everyone's going to be focused on tomorrow night.
This is so good to hear. I can't tell you. And I think there's so many things that are going on, but I think one of the things that you probably come up against, and I would like you to comment on this, is that sometimes older people, and anybody's older than you, but older people think that the youth hasn't had experience and they don't know, but I think that these next generations coming up are people who are really educated, aware, and so forth. So what do you see in that shift of older people and anybody over 40, seeing you guys as not having life experience and so forth? How would you answer that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to be clear, I am 23 years old. So I do count as, I think, one of the younger voters. But yeah, so, there has been this traditional narrative about young voters in general. And it doesn't just come from older folks, right? It has been perpetuated by national media in which young people like myself, my friends, our Gen Vote students are depicted as unreliable voters, right? We are apathetic. Like you said, some folks say that we don't have enough life experiences. And so we may not prioritize voting and civic engagement in our everyday lives when we're balancing school, new jobs, new apartments. But the reality is, and I think we have seen a shift in the narrative since the 2018 midterms. The reality is young people are not apathetic. Young people have enough lived experiences to make our voices heard in the ballot box. What the real issue is that folks do not know and may not be aware that there are major, unprecedented obstacles that young people have had to overcome in order to exercise our right to vote. And at Generation Vote, what we have done in the past year is work with local organizations, work with reporters, work with students to challenge that narrative that young people want to actually vote. And the reason why we're not turning out is not because we're apathetic, it's because we have to face all these barriers like not having access to poll sites on our college campuses, having really restrictive voter ID laws that make it harder and target student voters that don't have those IDs and things like that. So my answer to that is always, you have to dig deeper and look at why are young people not voting in these states. It's because there have been intentional and not intentional efforts to make it harder for young people to vote in the past few years.
So why do you think that it's set up that way? Why do you think there's a voter suppression aimed at younger voters?
Yeah, that's a great question, Diana. And I could probably go off about this forever. So feel free to ask any questions.
I want you to do this. I give you full permission to go for it.
Yeah. So why have we seen more efforts to specifically target and suppress the youth vote? The reason why we've seen this, especially since the 2008 election, is that people in power in both parties recognize that our generation is the most diverse generation that has ever come to be in this nation. And also, we are the most politically aware and engaged generation, right? We are not only taking to the streets, but we're mobilizing at the polls, we're mobilizing online. And so our generation has a lot of power if we realize it. And so what we've seen since the 2008 election, and especially since the 2018 midterms, where young people turned out in record-breaking numbers across the country, efforts by state governments to suppress the youth vote. And like I mentioned earlier, we've seen things like state legislatures passing laws that would eliminate polling sites from college campuses, right? Put in laws that would make it harder in voter ID states for students to obtain the proper voter identification necessary to vote. We've seen efforts in states to eliminate programs that would register young people to vote, such as automatic voter registration or pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. And so I think what's really interesting is that we've seen a lot of folks becoming more aware about this youth voter suppression crisis happening in states from like New York to New Hampshire to Florida to Texas, right? And starting to mobilize and fight for our right to vote. Because if we don't have that basic right to vote, we will not be able to have our voices heard, not just in 2020, but beyond too.
Wow, that really blows my mind. Of course, I'm not in that age range, so I wouldn't be so aware. So why do you think people are fearing the youth vote so much? You said because the youth are more diverse, but what does that do to people in power? Why would they fear that?
That's a good question. Yeah, so I think what's super interesting about our generation is that not only are we the most diverse, for example, I think that's really important when we talk about representation, right? And so young people recognize that it's important for us to have people in power, especially in local government, like city council, state legislatures, that look like us, right? So we see more and more young people getting involved in the electoral process to not only get out the vote, but to also work for younger candidates who tend to be more diverse, right? More, we're seeing more LGBTQ candidates and women candidates stepping up and challenging incumbents in power in communities which traditionally have had folks that are older, white, and more male, right? So representation. I think the other thing that people feel threatened by is that young people, like generation, my generation and millennials, tend to not align with political parties as much as older voters. And so we've seen in recent polls in the past 2 years, young people saying, yes, I'm going to vote, but I am not voting because I am a Republican or because I'm a Democrat. I am voting because of my ideological views and because I want to vote for healthcare, right? To vote for immigration reform, for criminal justice reform. And so you're seeing young people challenging the traditional party structure on both sides of the aisle and showing up to vote for policies that may threaten folks that are in power, both on the local and federal level.
That makes sense. But the other thing I was thinking, I mean, this is how I see it, and I'm so outside of what you guys are experiencing, but right now there is a two-party system that's pretty split. And in order to make any change, you need to get into that and then change from within, because I think if people stand on the outside and just criticize it, nothing happens. Mm-hmm. But we need you guys to be involved, even if it's not perfect. Someone said this, to vote for the candidate that is closest to what you believe, and don't expect them to be perfect, because they won't be. And not wait for the ideal candidate. And this makes me go back to 2016. And a lot of people did not vote, not just the youth, but a lot of people did not vote. And the youth vote was part of that. It didn't happen because, I voted. I did not like my choices, but I knew that there was one that would be at least more malleable, something that we could work with. So how do you see that? How do you see that?
Yeah, so that's a question, like the question of, why should I vote if I do not like any of my options on the ballot, right? I think that's something I've been hearing from so many young people, both within Generation Vote and also like when Gen Vote students are trying to register their friends to vote and get their friends out, or when I'm talking to my neighbors and my friends. But what I find interesting is that 2020 has really brought to light for a lot of people the fact that our nation is not only dealing with a national pandemic, but we're also dealing with a pandemic when it comes to racism, right? And dealing with institutions that perpetuate violence against particularly marginalized communities. And so I think that question of why should I vote if I don't like the option on the ballot has kind of been turned on its head, where now I think a lot of young people recognize, even if I don't like the option on the ballot, I have to vote anyway, as if my life depends on it, right? And as if my future depends on it. And so for a lot of young people who support things like having healthcare, universal healthcare, or having things like a Green New Deal, we have to vote in order to have politicians that would fight for these policies after 2020. And so I think that's something that I have seen to really come through in my conversations with young people, where they kind of go beyond the candidates even on the ballot at this point and see that this election is the most consequential election potentially for our lives, in our lives. And they're going to turn out to vote because of it.
And I think it is. It's dramatically out there. But I guess what I was thinking, as I was thinking about you and about Generation Vote, is that at least if you get somebody in office who's not perfect, but at least you will have a route to them, an access to them, then you can do your thing.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I wanted to think about how Greta Thunberg influenced voters, do you think, or our nation, to see young people differently? She is amazing. And when she came to the UN and when she was on different shows and so forth, she has no filter. And
Yeah.
we need that. We need people without filters, because I think so many people dissemble in our politic, and when we need people just saying how it is. So do you think that she helped the youth movement?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Greta, so I'm happy that you brought her up. And yeah, I think in terms of not just Greta, but all the young people who've stepped up to lead national movements in the past few years, is that one of the reasons why we see that they are unfiltered is because they're angry. We are angry, right? Because a lot of people like Greta, we grew up in a world where it sometimes feels like we're helpless, right? We're seeing our world burning, but yet our politicians are not responding in an adequate way, or at least fast enough. We're living in a world where every other week we see actions of police brutality on our cell phones, right? And doing school drills where we have to worry about gun violence in our schools. And so I think this unfiltered, this idea of young people just saying how it is because they feel like they have no other option, right? And that we need to step up. And so I think that it has impacted the way that the nation has viewed young activists. And I think in the note of Greta, even though she's not a citizen in the United States, but again, with all the other young people that she's worked with in the climate movement, it's also, I think, changed a little bit or progressed the idea of why can we not have, lower the voting age in this nation, right? We have young people stepping up to lead these national movements who are not eligible to vote in this election and are 16 or 17-year-old, but they're putting everything on the line. How come they don't have a say in the future of our country? And so I think that's one, in terms of the voting rights conversation, I think people like Greta and other national activists and national movements have started to put that question into the forefront of our voting rights conversations. And I'm hoping to see it continue after this election.
Yeah, I from my point of view, I actually think that it really will. I think people are starting to understand and starting to respect the viewpoint of youth. And the other thing that is very important, and you won't have known this probably, but your generation at 16, 17, 18 is very different than my generation at 16, 17, 18. I mean, my generation at that age, you wouldn't have want them in office. But you guys it's like you stand on our shoulders, you stand on what we've learned, and it keeps going, just like your kids will stand on your shoulders, and it will be a very different world. But I think that there's an old stuck part of the population that just doesn't want change, and even when it's right in their face. So I'm sure it's got to be a very helpless feeling for you guys when you look at that. I mean, I know how I feel, and my life is well through, so I can't imagine what it must be for you to look at that and think, wow, what's this about? So
yeah, no, especially especially when the folks that seem so stubborn and refuse to see the change in public opinion and the change in the public's will regarding really crucial issues for our generation. It is frustrating, right? But that's also why it is so important for us to talk to younger voters who are now, I think, the largest voting bloc in this country, right? Between ages of 18. Yeah, exactly. And so we need to make sure that our friends and our families know that, hey, yeah, this person may seem, impossible to move on this XYZ issue that you care about. But guess what? This other person that's running for office and is on the ballot endorses these issues and is willing to hold town halls and willing to have a participatory democratic process in our community. So we need to vote for them, right? And that's just the first step. So it can truly feel helpless, but I think one of the most empowering things about voting is that if we have folks like that in office, we can vote them out, right? And we can do that on both sides of the aisle.
Yep, absolutely. And I was looking up some other things. Michael Tubbs, you know who Michael Tubbs is? Have you ever heard of him? Okay, I mean, he's 23 years old. He's the mayor in Scranton, California, is it? And he's, now that city is operating in the black, and people are off the streets there, and he's dealing with the homeless and all of that stuff. And then there's somebody in Ithaca. Wait a minute, let me see if I can find out who. Savante,
yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, these young mayors are turning things around. They're demonstrating that youth has the energy, has a vision, and can make a difference. And one of the things that I wanted to talk with you about is, I think the older generation, and I mean people who are probably my age that are in Congress like forever, I think a lot of them went in for prestige, for self-aggrandizement. And do you think that the youth who are coming into government, do you feel like they're there for a different reason, or are they going to get stuck in that Washington kind of vortex that makes people greedy?
Yeah, and I'm thinking of like my own heroes I'm looking to in terms of Congress, like AOC and Ayanna Pressley and Ilhan Omar. I mean, I hope that they don't get stuck in that cycle. They're young and they just started their political careers in Washington. But I think what makes them different, and what makes the newer class, and potentially we'll see what happens tomorrow, of folks in Congress is that they are willing to listen to their constituents, right? And as their constituents become, again, more diverse, right? As more young people becoming eligible to vote in their districts and making their voices heard, I believe, at least I would like to hope, that they will continue to hold true to what they ran on, which was, running with campaigns that were not funded by corporate lobbyists that usually then kind of force folks into that, like you said, that cycle of, not listening to their constituents and just kind of absorbing all the greed in Washington, right? Like many of these candidates ran on campaigns that were completely funded by people in their communities, right? And are continuing to advocate for policies that would take big money out of politics to prevent, future classes of representatives from taking advantage of big money that would then cause them to listen to corporate lobbyists and not the everyday voter in their district, right? And so I would hope that they would continue to support these policies and more, and hold true again to their promise of running and listening to the people in their districts. And like I said, and as the districts become more diverse and more engaged, like I think we can hopefully break that cycle.
What is it, from your lips to God's ears, I hope. One of the other things I was thinking about too, is your organization, Generation Vote, are you starting to groom people to run for office?
Good question. So a little bit about Generation Vote. We are a completely youth-led organization that is currently based in New York, and we also have chapters in Florida. And we are committed to advancing a movement for advancing youth voting rights in New York State and beyond, as well as transforming the way young people engage in local politics. And the way that we help transform civic engagement on the local level is working with young people through our Gen Vote model of engagement to help them support local progressive candidates running for office who are willing to endorse youth voting rights reforms, as well as other issues that young people care about in their communities. And sometimes those people that they support are other young folks that are within the Generation Vote program and running for office. So yes, we do have a program that is built to train young organizers to engage in local politics through different ways of like research, mobilizing, getting out the vote. But also that same model of engagement can be used to work with young folks who are running for office in their communities, whether it be city council, school board, or state legislature.
Because I think that's something that absolutely has to happen. And do you know about the Emerge program? Have you heard of that?
Yes, Emerge is great. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's another one, and I didn't write it down, so I can't tell you what it is. But it's another program to train. I think it's young women as well. to run for office and focus on the platform that is about climate change and racial tensions and all of that stuff. So are you affiliated with them, or are you trying to work with them at all, or is that something that's not important?
Yeah, I think it's super important. I think maybe the other group you're thinking of is Ignite. Is that the other group, maybe?
Maybe, but I think there's one more and I can't remember. And it was one specifically that was on, I would think, the youth issues. Mm-hmm. And I'll send it to you if I'll go look at it. I can't do it right now, but yeah. So will you be working with other groups, do you think? Or do you think that you have enough going in your own group where you can really train people?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when I started Generation Vote, I was a student at Binghamton University in the fall of 2017, I believe, so almost 3 years ago. And when I started Generation Vote, I initially started the program to be like Ignite and Emerge and the groups that you're discussing. So I started it in like that post-Trump wave of resistance organizing, right? To again train young people to engage in local politics. So we have worked closely with organizations like Emerge and folks on the local level as we have built out our Gen Vote model of engagement for training young organizers working in local politics. I think moving forward, though, one thing that we have been working on in Generation Vote is that, you know, when we started it, it was again part of that resistance organizing, right? We want to elect young progressives into office that support our issues that we care about. But in the process of engaging all these, young people in local politics, we realized that young people face unique and institutional barriers to getting out the vote, and that there is this youth voter suppression crisis that disproportionately affects, young voters of color in our country. And so we at Generation Vote decided to actually expand our youth voting rights work, and we will continue to do that in 2021. And so we are right now looking at our current model of organizing and how we train young folks in local politics to then advance our agenda for, pushing forward youth-friendly democracy reforms and endorsing candidates that support those issues. So we're kind of in a transition period from moving a little bit away of groups like, Emerge, from being like traditional progressive organizing support programs to focusing more on our democracy work in the coming years.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a good move. There's so much that, I mean, you have to zero in. And then what I like very much hearing is that you're evolving and you're paying attention and not getting stuck. One of the things that I was curious about your opinion, do you feel like Gen Z and millennials, do you feel like there's a lot of shared opinions about things? Do you feel like they're divisive? How do you see those groups?
Yeah, so I do think that recent studies within the past few months have shown that there is a slight disagreement, I think, between millennial voters and Gen Z voters about our alignment regarding certain ideological views on things like healthcare and criminal justice in particular. But this is like, our first major presidential election for many Gen Z voters that are voting for the first time. So I think it's going to be super interesting to see once we get the data, what the differences were, what the margins were, right? And the younger Gen Z voters and who they voted for versus millennials, and when they voted and why they voted, right? When it comes to all the exit polls that are going to come out. So I think this election is going to really hopefully share at least an answer for that, because I think polls are one thing, and as we learned in 2016, polls aren't everything. And so what I'm interested to see is like when it actually comes down to casting our ballot and who we're voting for and what lines we're voting on, right? What's the difference between millennial voters who this may be their second presidential election versus first time like Gen Z voters who are engaging in this process for the first time?
Yeah, that is going to be fascinating to find out.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I wanted to ask you, in your experience dealing with so many young people, when there is division in issues, Are you guys able to work through them? Because we're seeing in the older generations, they're not doing a good job.
Mm.
And it's very important to be able to talk about things, talk about issues without being so polarized. And even if there's strong disagreement, you can learn from the other side always.
Mm.
So what are you
Mm.
seeing?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think it's something that our Gen Vote chapters are grappling with all the time, especially when they organize on college campuses. And so some ways that our students have tried to foster a healthy culture of civic debate and engagement on their campuses are things like having, open candidate forums where they invite folks from both sides of the aisle who are running for office to engage with young voters about why they're running and what their differences are, and also give the young voters in the crowd the opportunity to talk about why they are voting for one candidate versus the other. Our students have also done things like creating civic engagement committees at the universities to work with their administration and to work with a wide, diverse group of student organizations that represent all sorts of folks in the ideological spectrum, to come together and think about ways to, have civic engagement, things like, Jeopardy nights on campuses, or doing Get Out the Vote together in ways that are, nonpartisan. And again, building that relationship of trust and ability to work together to engage students, even if they have differences in opinion. And one thing that to answer to also like your question, I thought about our Gen Vote Summit that we held in November of 2019, just a year ago. And at this Gen Vote Summit, it was the first ever New York Youth Voting Rights and Engagement Summit that we held in Albany, New York. And we brought together over 70 young people from high schools and colleges and voting rights activists to basically talk about the challenges that they have faced when trying to engage voters. And your question was raised several times, right? And at the end of it, the participants voted on the first ever New York Youth Voting Rights and Engagement platform that basically put forth reforms and policies that would support and advance youth voting rights and civic engagement policies to help young people on the local level do this work across the state.
Oh, that's fabulous. That's really wonderful. And the other, I mean, I could talk to you forever, but the other thing I wanted to ask you about, I think in my generation and generations between me and the millennials, which is a few, that trust is gone. I mean, most people don't trust anyone. And I'm wondering how you guys are faring in that. Are you learning to build trust together? Are you seeing that people are trusting what you're trying to create?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I on the note of trust, I definitely think, and I will be real, 2020 has been a really hard year, right? And like I said earlier, I firmly believe that we're facing two pandemics in this country. And as a result, I understand when I talk to young people how they don't have any trust about folks on the other side, on both sides of the aisle, right? And they also are like, what's the point, right? Like, given all the events of 2020, how can I bring myself to understand the other side, right? So not only is there like just lack of trust, but also I think a lack of willingness to even try to get that trust. But what I think is so important, what we've seen, especially in the past 2 months, is that young people have stepped up and texted their friends and families on both sides of the aisle, right? And said, hey, like, I know we may disagree on these things, but we need to make sure that we are reaching out to as many people as we can to get out the vote this election, right? Because we want to make sure that we have record-breaking turnout to send a message to Washington about the issues that we care about. So even if we don't agree, we're still going to try our darn hardest to get that +3 people to vote, right? And hopefully convince them to vote for your side, but that's more partisan work, and we do nonpartisan work at Generation Vote. So again, just working with young people to engage with folks on both sides of the aisle, and that kind of helps foster that beginning of trust when doing civic engagement work.
Yeah, because I think it really rests with you guys. I hate to put all this on you, but I think it does.
Heavy.
Yeah, it is a lot. But
Yeah.
I think that, you know, you guys have the energy and the issues are really hitting home for you. I think sometimes older people get so isolated and insulated from stuff. They don't get it. Like climate change, if it's not wrecking their day, you know, whatever. If they have health insurance, it's like, oh, well, you know, if they have a house to live in and other people are living on the street, it's like, so I'm wondering if you guys have a different sensibility about all that. And that is being able to be concerned for other people just out, not in your own little world, but in the larger world. And that's what we've needed so much. So do you think that's happening in your generations?
For sure. And I think when you asked about like different sensibility, right? I would be honest, I think social media and the way that civic engagement organizing has changed in the past 10 years is a big reason for that. And so like, just even speaking from personal experience, right? I have a cell phone, right? And I'm on all the apps, right? Where within like 5 seconds, I can see what my friends are doing in the West Coast and they send me pictures of their backyards on fire, right? 5 seconds later, I can see a video of another Black man and woman being harmed on the streets. And so even though it's not happening, you know, on my block, I still see it in the palm of my hand. And, you know, I think young people have really stepped up this election, given the pandemic, to really push forward how we think about utilizing social media for not only organizing, but also raising awareness about these really important issues, even if it may not seem like it's happening in your backyard. Well, guess what? No excuse. You can get this information. But I will say the caveat, it's important that we not only get this information, but that we make sure that the information is trusted and correct and accurate, and working with young people to recognize when they see misinformation online, because it is so easy to access anything these days.
It is, and there are organizations set up that show you how to track stuff so you can see what's real and what's not real.
Right.
So what do you think, if you would just enumerate what the top issue is for your generations?
Yeah, so, you know, I want to say voting rights and democracy, because that's my top issue. And I think it has become more of a popular issue amongst young people, but we're not quite there yet. I'm not sure voting rights is a base building issue for young voters like Generation Z and millennials. I think what we've seen so far is that a lot of young people are turning out to vote this election because they are concerned about things like climate justice and healthcare. And probably the third would be immigration reform. They know that those three things are on the ballot, and that we have to turn out to vote to ensure that we have a future, a livable future, right? And I think those are the three main issues that I've seen so far in terms of what's getting young people to the polls so far and tomorrow.
Yeah, that makes sense. And one of the things I learned, I worked for Bernie Sanders a long time ago, and then I worked for Joe Cunningham. I'm in South Carolina. And I learned that democracy, and I put this in an article, and the article was about democracy is not easy, and it takes every one of us, even if it doesn't seem like it. It needs everybody, and it needs that sense of engagement and so forth. And even if it's just voting, that's powerful. That's really powerful. So it's like a learning curve, I think. And I think the millennials and the Gen Zs are just beginning to understand that, how much power they have. They have enormous power. And you were right, they are the largest voting bloc, by the way. So if every one of you guys stepped up, you could have the election of your choice.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's gotten lost. I think over the last 4 years, or almost 4 years, people have started to feel really helpless because they've been told they're helpless. And people can tell you something all day long. It doesn't make it true. You can threaten people all day long. It doesn't make it reality. And my hope is, and my deepest wish is that you guys don't get caught in that, and that you step up and you do your thing, because we need you. There's no question that we need you. So the other thing I wanted to ask you, are you thinking about branching out? I'm in South Carolina. We desperately need you here. I think you're needed all over. So how can that happen? And are you thinking about doing that?
Yes, we are. And I would love, Diane, and anyone else watching this to think about ways that we can bring Gen Vote to South Carolina after this election. So we are actively expanding our Gen Vote program. So if you're interested in getting involved with Generation Vote, you can join our Gen Vote college organizing program. Check it out at genvote.org. And we are also building out Gen Vote hubs in local cities and counties, so we can, engage folks that are either high school students or, people out of college, to raise awareness about the importance of not only voting in your community, but fighting for your right to vote and fighting for, civic engagement, authentic civic engagement at the local level. So if you're interested in anything like that, check us out at genvote.org or our Twitter, Instagram handles, genvoteus. And you can reach out to us directly to see if we can bring a Gen Vote program to you.
That would be so wonderful. So how can older people help you guys?
Same thing. So in terms of the older folks who are outside of college, for example, if you are interested in getting involved with the Gen Vote Hub, Gen Vote Hubs will be open to all folks. It's not age restricted. The only thing that we're asking for our Gen Vote Hubs is to prioritize youth leadership. So whoever is organizing the leadership committees in your community to be primarily led by young folks, and make sure they have a seat at the table. So again, if you are anyone who's watching this, if you're interested in learning more about Generation Vote and about our vision for advancing youth voting rights and fighting against voter suppression across the country, reach out to us, because we have a lot of work to do after 2020. So much work.
And I can see it happen to me. I feel not only your passion, but I feel your ability to look at things, to see clearly. And it's wonderful to get excited about something, but in the long haul, it's just dedication. It's getting up every day and doing it, even the days you don't feel like it. Exactly. And that's what I feel in you. So I have great respect and great hope for you. So I know this is going to be very, very important. And yeah, we'll see if we can get it here. South Carolina needs something so desperately. I can't. Oh yeah, it is. So Brianna Sia, thank you so much, and thank you for the work you're doing with Generation Vote. How important that is. So I can't thank you enough.
And thank you for having me and for those kind words. It means a lot, especially before Election Day. So hang in there, stay sane, everyone. We'll get through this, and we'll see you on the other side.
We will. And thank you to our audience for Transformation Podcast, interviewing people, changing our world. I'm your host, Diane J. Shaver, and you can see previous interviews with world changers at Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, Apple, all the rest of it. So please check those out. And this interview will be up after Election Day, so it'll be really, really very poignant and very powerful to see it. So I look forward to seeing you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.